In the winter of the year 40, under the reign of Gaius Caesar, a man the legions had nicknamed Caligula, a new kind of cold had settled over Rome. It was a cold that had little to do with the season. It crept from the marbled halls of the Palatine Hill, a chill that seeped not into the bones but into the soul. This was the climate of political terror, but it was far more intimate, more personal than mere executions or prescriptions. It was a meticulously designed system of humiliation, an architecture of shame built to degrade the Roman nobility from the inside out. Ancient sources speak of this time not with the detached language of history, but with a hushed, horrified whisper. They agree that the emperor, a man once hailed as the empire's salvation, now used his absolute power as a scalpel, not to remove dissent, but to carve away the dignity of the patrician class, one family at a time. He imposed rituals and protocols that were not meant to command respect, but to engineer public disgrace. Consider the case of Marcus Claudius, a senator of advanced age and impeccable lineage, a man whose ancestors had bled for the Republic. Tradition tells us he was summoned to the imperial palace not to offer counsel, but to perform a duty. He was forced to stand as a silent witness, torch in hand, illuminating a scene of calculated violation involving his kin, his direct descendants. He was made a spectator to the breaking of his bloodline. This episode was not a grotesque exception. It was the rule. It was a single, perfectly executed note in a symphony of degradation, a system carefully designed to shatter the spirit of the Roman elite. The administrative records of the palace, with the chilling banality of bureaucracy, noted the names and numbers of those who were compelled to pass through the great bronze doors. Their suffering was reduced to a simple ledger entry. Their ordeal transformed into an official procedure. Violence became paperwork. Caligula's purpose was not simply the indulgence of physical cruelty. That would have been the work of a common brute. It was a far more sophisticated and more insidious form of tyranny. He sought to secure the involuntary complicity of his victims and their families. By forcing a father to watch, a husband to listen, and a brother to remain silent, he made them participants in their destruction. He understood a fundamental truth about power. Fear is a potent political instrument, but shame is a permanent one. It becomes an indelible mark upon the soul, a poison that a family carries for generations. He was not just attacking the Senate of his time, he was sowing the earth of its future, ensuring that nothing honourable could ever grow there again. To understand how Rome, the heart of the civilized world, reached this abyss, you must rewind the clock. Go back to a sun-drenched morning in the year 37. A young man only 25 years old was hailed as the hope of the empire, Gaius Julius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus, known affectionately by the soldiers as Caligula, or Little Boot, for the miniature military boots he wore as a child in his father's army camps. He was the son of the beloved General Germanicus, a hero whose name was synonymous with Roman virtue. His ascension to the throne was met with a wave of euphoria that swept across the empire, a celebration that lasted for 100 glorious days. The people saw in him the heir to a divine dynasty, a fresh start. The senators, men who had lived in constant fear under the paranoid and reclusive rule of Tiberius, breathed a collective sigh of relief. No one could have imagined that this charismatic, educated and cultured young man, this beacon of hope, would soon become the architect of the most organised system of depravity that Rome had ever known. His childhood had been a harrowing paradox of privilege and horror. He grew up in military camps, a mascot adored by the legions who revered his father. He was surrounded by the love of soldiers, the purest form of loyalty in the Roman world. But he also witnessed the venomous intrigues of the palace that ultimately consumed his family. He saw his heroic father, Germanicus, die suddenly, likely from poison. He watched as his mother, Agrippina the Elder, a woman of fierce pride, was exiled to a barren island to starve. He saw his older brothers executed or imprisoned on trumped-up charges, their names erased from public record. He learned to survive in the snake pit of Tiberius's court, on the island of Capri, by mastering the art of the mask. He played the part of an inoffensive, even stupid, young man, hiding his intelligence behind a vacant smile. Those years of silent observation taught him a fundamental lesson about power in Rome. Survival depended entirely on one's ability to deceive, and he had become a master. When he finally took power, the first months were a dream. He was everything Tiberius was not. He slashed unjust taxes, released political prisoners who had languished in dungeons for years, and organised magnificent games and spectacles for the public. He was a builder, commissioning aqueducts, repairing roads, and securing the empire's infrastructure. He distributed long overdue bonuses to the legions, securing their loyalty not just through heritage, but through gratitude. Rome fell deeply in love with him. Women would leave flowers on the path where his litter was to pass. Children sang songs about their young, vibrant emperor. And the senators, the very same men who would later be forced to hold torches at his debauched ceremonies, competed fiercely for his favour, showering him with honours. It was the golden age everyone had prayed for after the dark, suspicious years of Tiberius. The contrast was absolute. Where Tiberius had been a paranoid recluse, Caligula walked freely through the streets of Rome, attended the games in the Circus Maximus, and dined with senators in their homes. He was accessible, he was charming, and he was generous. The people of Rome truly believed that the gods had finally blessed them with the perfect ruler, a man who embodied the best of his Julio-Claudian lineage. But something broke. In the autumn of that very same year, 37, a mysterious illness brought the young emperor to the brink of death. He was confined to his bed for weeks, and the entire empire held its breath. The court physicians, in their private journals, wrote of terrifying symptoms. They described delirious fevers that reached impossible temperatures, and violent convulsions so powerful that it required 6 men to hold him down. They wrote of his visions, how he would scream in the dead of night, insisting that he was speaking with Jupiter himself, arguing with the king of the gods as an equal. For days, a palpable sense of dread hung over Rome. Mass sacrifices were performed in every temple, from the grandest structures on the Capitoline Hill to the smallest neighbourhood shrines. Citizens gathered in the forum, their faces etched with worry. Some even made public vows, promising to give their own lives in exchange for the recovery of their beloved emperor. And then he woke up. But the man who returned from the fevered darkness was not the same man who had entered it. He was someone else entirely. The first signs were subtle, like cracks appearing in a flawless marble facade, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. He issued a decree, simple and yet earth-shattering in its arrogance. All the most revered statues of the gods in Rome, the very images of Jupiter, Apollo, and Mars that had received the prayers of the people for centuries, were to have their heads removed. They were to be replaced with perfect marble likenesses of his own. It was a quiet declaration of war on heaven itself. He was no longer the gods' chosen representative on earth. He was their replacement. The Senate, still basking in the glow of his early benevolence, approved the measure without dissent. They told themselves it was a young man's eccentricity, a flamboyant gesture of piety. They were wrong. It was a statement of intent. Then came the unthinkable, the slow unravelling of the man himself. They say the body does not lie, and the body of Caligula, after the illness, told a story of terrifying transformation. His eyes, once described by poets as warm and expressive, had become cold, calculating voids. Servants whispered that his pupils seemed permanently dilated, like 2 dark wells reflecting a starless night, seeing things that were not there. He developed a chronic, gnawing insomnia that gave him no rest. He would wander the vast, silent corridors of the palace in the dead of night, a lone figure draped in silk, holding animated conversations with the statues that now bore his face. He would stand on the balconies and speak to the moon, sometimes cajoling it, other times threatening it, demanding it come down to his bed. The palace staff would find him at dawn in the imperial gardens, often naked, covered in dirt and dew, his hands raw from digging in the earth. When they asked what he was doing, he would smile a strange, serene smile and say he had been planting the future of Rome. But what he was planting were not seeds. They were the roots of a monstrous new order. He began with his flesh and blood, with his sisters. Drusilla, Julia Livilla, and Agrippina the Younger were not just his family, they were the first test subjects in his new laboratory of power, the first to learn that, in his Rome, all traditional boundaries were erased. His obsession with his sister Drusilla was particularly intense, a feverish, possessive fixation that he did not attempt to hide. He paraded it before the Roman elite as a new kind of royal bond. He called her his Diana, his goddess of the hunt. In public, he treated her not as a sibling, but as a wife, his one true consort. He forced her to sit in the empress's designated place at official banquets, a flagrant violation of every Roman custom. When she died suddenly, in the year 38, Caligula's grief was not that of a mourning brother. It was the psychotic rage of a god whose favourite toy had been broken. He plunged the entire empire into a state of forced mourning. He issued an edict forbidding anyone to laugh, to bathe, or to dine with their own family for the duration of the official period. Any citizen caught showing even a hint of joy was summarily executed for treason. But his pain was not love. It was possession frustrated. With Drusilla dead, he turned his rapacious attention to his two remaining sisters, and then methodically, he widened his scope to encompass the wives and daughters of the entire Roman Senate. He began to host gatherings in the palace that were nothing more than organised sexual assaults, masquerading as imperial parties. He forced the most noble women in Rome to prostitute themselves with other senators, with knights and even with favoured palace guards while he watched. He had a gilded throne constructed specifically for these occasions, where he would sit, observing the degradation from on high. He would take notes on a wax tablet, clinically documenting the proceedings. Who showed the most enthusiasm? Who hesitated? Who tried to be gentle with the woman assigned to them? These notes were not the ramblings of a madman. They were instruments of political blackmail. A senator who had been observed being overly enthusiastic with Julia Livilla would suddenly find his political fortunes rising, his every proposal sailing through the Senate. Another who had shown reluctance, a flicker of human decency, would find his youngest son had disappeared, only to be returned days later, castrated. The message was clear. The message was absolute. In the new Rome of Caligula, everyone was a potential victim and a potential accomplice. There was no space for neutrality. There was no ground to stand on that was not tainted by either suffering or collaboration. The system was designed to implicate everyone, to turn the Roman elite against itself. It was one thing to fear a tyrant's wrath. It was another thing entirely to become a gear in the machine of his depravity. Your survival purchased with the dignity of your peers, your silence paid for by the violation of your neighbour's wife. This was Caligula's true innovation. He did not want to simply rule over men's bodies. He wanted to own their souls, to hollow them out and leave nothing behind but a shell of shame and complicity. He was building an empire not of subjects, but of co-conspirators. Surviving records, hidden for centuries in the ruins of a villa near Pompeii, paint a picture of this horror with the cold precision of a clinical report. These were the secret journals of the imperial physician, a man named Lucius Scriba. In his elegant scholarly Latin, he describes how Caligula would compel him to personally examine the wives and daughters of the patrician class. His task was not to heal, but to evaluate. He was to assess their reproductive capacity and their physical resilience to what he termed continued use. These examinations were a ritual of humiliation in themselves. They were conducted in the emperor's presence, who would recline on a couch, eating grapes and asking a stream of obscene, invasive questions about each woman's anatomy, her history, and her very essence. It was not chaotic sadism. It was systematic. It was bureaucratic. It was documented with the same meticulousness a quartermaster would use to inventory grain supplies. Each victim was assigned a number, a designation that stripped her of her name, her family, and her identity. Every act performed upon her was recorded, categorized, and filed. There were established fees, a grotesque price list for human dignity, 16 sesterces for a night with a senator's wife, a sum just high enough to be an insult, 2,000 for his virgin daughter, a price that acknowledged her value only to profane it, 5,000 for both, simultaneously, a package deal in degradation. The money collected by imperial functionaries went directly into the state treasury. In the official accounts, these vast sums were recorded as voluntary donations for the welfare of the state. The system was not just depraved, it was profitable. The violation of Rome's elite was bankrolling the emperor's grand construction projects and lavish games. The women's bodies were being transformed into a source of state revenue. The Palatine Hill, the very heart of Roman power, was physically transformed. Caligula began to refer to his palace as the Temple of Divine Service. This was not a metaphor. It was a complete architectural and functional reorganization. Specific rooms were repurposed and redesigned for specific acts of violation. The grand reception hall, where ambassadors had once presented their credentials, became the Hall of Jupiter. This was the chamber for ritualistic rapes, where the emperor, sometimes dressed as the god himself, would act out his divine supremacy, blessing his female subjects with his divine seed. Another wing was designated the Chamber of Venus, used for forced orgies where Roman matrons, women revered as the bedrock of the family, were compelled to recreate mythological scenes of abduction and sexual violence. Then there was the Room of Priapus, a small windowless chamber reserved for sexual torture, its walls decorated with elaborate, obscene frescoes that the emperor had personally commissioned from the finest artists in Rome. The cool travertine marble walls, which had once echoed with debates about law, philosophy, and the destiny of the known world, now resonated with entirely different sounds. And the senators, the men whose fathers and grandfathers had built this empire with their blood and wisdom, had to walk those same corridors every day. They had to hear the muffled sounds. They had to see the downcast eyes of the servants. They had to know, and they had to remain silent. To speak would be to sign the death warrant, not just for oneself, but for one's entire family. The system had a diabolical complexity, layers of psychological warfare that defied comprehension. First, there were the senators' wives, who were forced to serve in what Caligula called the imperial cult. They were given assigned schedules, specific uniforms, often transparent silk togas from Syria that cost a fortune, and rituals they had to follow. They were no longer individuals, but a collective of priestesses serving the emperor's divine lust. Then came the daughters. From the age of 12, sometimes younger, they were gradually introduced into the system through what the emperor termed divine education. But Caligula went even further beyond mere personal gratification. He implemented what secret palace documents referred to as the selective breeding program. The most fertile women, as determined by the physician Lucius Scriba, were forced to conceive children by the emperor. These children were to be raised as a new class of imperial slaves, perfect in form and utterly loyal, knowing no parent but their divine father. They would be trained from birth to serve the emperor's every desire. A generation born into absolute servitude. The physician Scriba noted every forced pregnancy, every birth, and every infant death. The death toll was high. Many women, in their desperation, resorted to dangerous secret methods of abortion rather than bring a child into this living hell. Their silent resistance was written in the blood and tragedy that stained the hidden corners of the imperial palace. The men were not spared. Their humiliation was simply a different flavour, a different texture of degradation. Caligula instituted the practice of feminizing the young sons of patrician families. It was a calculated assault on Roman masculinity, on the very ideals of virtus and gravitas that were the foundation of their identity. He would have them brought to the palace, their togas stripped away from them. He would have them dressed in the transparent saffron-dyed robes of a courtesan. He would have their faces painted with the white lead and red ochre of a prostitute. His servants would teach them how to walk, how to speak, and how to gesture with the affected mannerisms of a woman. Then they would be paraded at his banquets, their shame a form of entertainment for the emperor and his chosen guests. They were put up for auction and sold for a night to the highest bidder. The emperor himself often participated in these acts, not, the sources suggest, out of any particular desire, but for the sheer exercise of power. Each violation was a political statement, a meticulously crafted message sent to the Roman elite. There is nothing sacred that I cannot profane. There is no tradition that I cannot corrupt. There is no family that I cannot destroy. He was deconstructing their world, brick by bloody brick, and forcing them to watch. But the most perverse, the most truly diabolical aspect of this entire system was how it co-opted the victims into their destruction. The fathers did not just know what was happening to their wives and children. They were made for Juve Zilgehu Sorluij. They held the torches that illuminated the scenes of their family's dishonour. They signed the legal documents, the contracts of voluntary service for their wives and daughters. In the Senate, they stood and voted in favour of the laws that legitimised these abuses, such as the infamous Lex de Divina Corporis, a law that formally established that the emperor's body was sacred and that any union with it, no matter the circumstances, was a religious honour. Caligula had discovered something far more cruel than simple tyranny. He had perfected the art of forced complicity. He wasn't destroying families from the outside with force, he was making them rot from within, turning each member into the executioner of the others. The father became the pimp, the mother the accomplice, and the child the sacrifice. The story of Senator Publius Cornelius serves as a chilling testament to this method. When the order came for him to deliver his wife, Livia, to the divine service, he refused. It was an act of unimaginable bravery, a suicidal stand on the floor of the Senate. He spoke of honour, of Roman tradition, of the sanctity of marriage. The other senators sat in stony, terrified silence. The next morning, his 8-year-old son was found on the steps of the Senate House. He was still alive, bleeding, castrated. Carved into the soft skin of his chest was a single, brutal message. Disobedience has generational consequences. The message was not just for Cornelius, it was for all of them. That very afternoon, a broken Publius Cornelius personally escorted his wife, Livia, to the palace gates. 3 months later, when Livia was confirmed to be pregnant with the emperor's child, Cornelius was forced to make a public declaration. He had to stand before the Senate and formally acknowledge the bastard as his legitimate heir, legally disinheriting his true-born children in favour of the offspring of his wife's rape. Humiliation was now enshrined in Roman law. In a unanimous vote, the Senate passed a decree stating that any child of the emperor, regardless of the mother's marital status, had precedence in succession over any legitimate children. The system was now self-perpetuating. The very men being destroyed were now the ones passing the laws to make their destruction legal, permanent, and absolute. This vast machinery of horror required its elaborate bureaucracy, an administration that rivaled that of the empire itself. A secret archive was established in the substructures of the Palatine Hill, staffed by specialized scribes who did nothing but keep the records. Each entry was a masterpiece of cold, detached detail. There were specific categories: name of the victim, age, social status, and a precise physical description. Then a list of the acts performed, their duration, and a chillingly bureaucratic assessment of the victim's level of cooperation. There were notes on resulting pregnancies and payments received by the Treasury. A team of physicians was assigned to the archive, their role to examine the victims before and after their service, documenting injuries, transmitted diseases, and pregnancies with clinical dispassion. Midwives were on the imperial payroll to attend the forced births. Elite guardsmen were tasked with transporting the victims according to a complex, unchangeable schedule. Accountants managed the profits, for this was a business, and the emperor demanded a detailed accounting of his earnings. Hundreds of people participated in this machinery of horror, each performing their specific function, each with their small piece of the guilt, their share of the responsibility diluted in the vastness of the collective crime. It was easier that way. No single person was the monster. They were all just gears in a machine that no one dared to stop. The nights of the full moon were reserved for special events, elaborate spectacles of depravity that required weeks of preparation. Caligula organised what he called ceremonies of lunar fertility. The private amphitheatre within the palace grounds, a place normally used for intimate plays and musical performances, was transformed into a pagan temple to his divine lust. Here, he would force the wives of the most powerful senators to copulate with gladiators, men selected for their brute strength and virility. He would have them perform with Nubian slaves, brought from the farthest frontiers of the empire, their dark skin a deliberate contrast to the pale nobility of the Roman matrons. Sometimes he used animals, trained bears, massive Molossian hounds, and even a leopard that the emperor had received as a gift from a client king in Africa. The husbands were required to attend. They were made to sit in the tiered stone seats of the amphitheatre, dressed in their formal senatorial togas, their faces impassive masks of composure. They watched as their wives were degraded in ways that defied the human imagination. The emperor himself directed the entire spectacle, the divine master of ceremonies. He would stand in the centre of the arena, holding a special sceptre decorated with golden phalluses, using it to point, to select, and to pair. He would decide who went with whom, how many times, and in what specific positions. It was a performance, and he was the playwright, director, and sole critic. All the while, the scribes sat in a designated section, their styluses scratching away on wax tablets, noting everything: names, acts, durations, and any notable performances. It was the ultimate theatre of absolute power, where human suffering was transformed into imperial entertainment, where the sacred bonds of marriage were publicly and systematically dismantled for sport. A complete shadow economy grew up around this system, a dark ecosystem feeding on the misery of the elite. Merchants in the city began to specialise in selling ointments and oils that promised to reduce the pain and scarring from these ordeals. Back alley healers did a brisk trade in abortifacient potions, brewed from dangerous herbs in secret. Cunning procuracies, once catering to the city's brothels, now offered private lessons to the young daughters of the nobility, teaching them not the arts of seduction, but the techniques of survival. Physicians, for a high price, specialised in repairing the physical damage. Their skills were in high demand. Everyone was taking a cut. Everyone was participating. Everyone, in some small way, was profiting from the horror. The sickness of the palace had seeped into the very soil of Rome. The entire city had become an accomplice. The merchants in the Forum knew where the sudden influx of gold into the senatorial households was coming from. It was payment for their silence, for their participation. The priests in the temples blessed unions they knew were forced. Their prayers a hollow mockery. The poets, the finest literary minds of their generation, composed fawning odes to the emperor, describing his real-life atrocities in flowery, mythological language, as if they were the heroic deeds of a god. They say the body does not lie, and the bodies in Caligula's palace told stories that no official chronicle would ever dare record. There were the scars, which formed patterns on the skin, like some secret, terrible scripture of pain. There were the swollen bellies of unwanted pregnancies, which the women tried to hide beneath ever wider tunics, a futile attempt to conceal the living evidence of their shame. And there were the faces that had forgotten how to smile, where the muscles of joy seemed to have atrophied from disuse. There was one young woman, Valeria, the daughter of a minor senator. After months of systematic abuse, she had stopped speaking entirely. It was not a physical malady. The court physicians confirmed her vocal cords were perfectly functional. It was as if she had concluded that there were no words left in any human language to describe what she was living through each day. Her silence became a presence in the palace, a profound, unnerving void. The other victims began to avoid looking her in the eyes, as if they feared her silence was contagious, as if in her vacant stare they could see their inevitable future, forcing the daughters to witness the violation of their mothers. All the while he would stand nearby, providing a running commentary, narrating the scene like a poet reciting verses at a literary salon, praising a particular scream or a specific expression of anguish. He believed that by destroying the primal bond between mother and child, he was destroying the very essence of Rome itself. He was attacking the concept of pietas, that uniquely Roman virtue of duty to family, gods, and country, at its very root. This was not mere cruelty, it was a twisted, nihilistic philosophy. If he could corrupt the most sacred things, a mother's love, a child's innocence, a father's honour, then he was truly divine. The gods of myth, after all, were rapists and violators. Zeus himself had transformed into animals to satisfy his lust. Caligula saw himself as simply updating that tradition, bringing it to its logical, brutal conclusion in the real world. There were attempts at resistance. They were whispered, desperate, and almost always fatal. Some women tried to poison themselves before they were scheduled to be taken to the palace, ingesting hemlock or aconite stolen from the imperial gardens. Others deliberately disfigured themselves, scarring their faces with knives or hot coals, hoping to make themselves so repulsive that they would be deemed useless to the system. But Caligula had a countermeasure for everything. The women who attempted suicide were revived by the imperial physicians, who were experts in poisons and their antidotes. Their punishment was to be given double sessions, sometimes held publicly in the Forum, their failed escape serving as a warning to others. As for the disfigured, he used them anyway. He would proclaim that physical beauty was irrelevant to divine service. He argued, ugliness made the act purer, less contaminated by earthly aesthetic pleasure. There was no escape. Those who tried to flee the city were hunted down by the speculatores, the emperor's secret police, and dragged back for exemplary punishments that invariably involved the torture and execution of their entire families. The secret archive beneath the Palatine grew exponentially. Thousands of entries, each more detailed, more specific, and more chillingly bureaucratic than the last. Every conceivable act was given its code, its category, and its own subcategory. There were standardized forms to be filled out, protocols to be followed, and a rigid chain of command to be respected. It was the accounting of horror, as meticulous and ordered as the empire's tax records or its population censuses. On occasion, Caligula would have these records brought to the Senate. He would read entries aloud, choosing them at random, forcing fathers and husbands to listen to the clinical, dispassionate details of what had been done to their loved ones. Entry 346. Julia, wife of Marcus Antonius Primus. 4 hours, 6 participants, pregnancy confirmed. The public shame was an integral part of the punishment. The collective memory of the trauma was his intended legacy. He wanted Rome to never forget. He wanted every future generation to know what absolute power, untethered from morality and law, could truly do. The Praetorian Guard, the elite soldiers sworn to protect the emperor's life, was an integral part of the system. They were not just passive sentinels, they were active participants. Caligula would often reward his most loyal guardsmen by giving them the victims after he was finished with them himself. It was yet another calculated layer of humiliation. The noble women of Rome, violated first by their emperor, were then handed over to his bodyguards, common soldiers, many of whom were not even Roman citizens. And it was all documented, all archived for posterity. There was one Praetorian, an officer named Cassius Caria, a seasoned veteran of the Germanic wars. The emperor seemed to take a special pleasure in humiliating him. He constantly mocked Caria's high-pitched voice, forced him to use obscene, demeaning passwords to get past the guards, and would sometimes make him parade naked before the other soldiers. Caria had participated in the system like everyone else. He had taken his turn with the victims, he had held the torches, and he had kept his silence. But something inside him, some last ember of his soldier's pride, began to break. It was not compassion for the victims that finally drove him over the edge. It was rage at his relentless humiliation. The night of January 24th, in the year 41, was especially brutal. Caligula had organised another of his grotesque competitions. This one a divine fertility contest, where the wives of senators were pitted against gladiators in a race to achieve multiple pregnancies. Numbers were shouted out by scribes like bids at a slave auction: 20, 30, 40. The bodies in the arena moved mechanically, their eyes vacant, their souls long since departed. It was to be the final ceremony. The next day, as Caligula was walking through a subterranean corridor on his way to the theatre, Cassius Chaerea and a handful of other Praetorian conspirators ambushed him. They were the very men tasked with protecting him. They cornered him against a cold stone wall and stabbed him 30 times. The final wound, delivered by Chaerea himself, was a deliberate, symbolic thrust to the genitals. The irony was absolute. The men who finally killed him were not heroes or liberators. They were cogs in the very machine he had built. Men motivated not by justice, but by their own tarnished honour. An hour later, his wife, Melonia Caesonia, was murdered. His daughter, Julia Drusilla, barely 2 years old, was picked up by a soldier and her head was smashed against a wall. The Praetorians, in a state of panic and confusion, sought to erase every trace of his dynasty, but they could not erase the archives. They could not undo the pregnancies. They could not heal the scars, both visible and invisible. They could not erase the memory. The new emperor, Claudius, a man who had survived Caligula's reign by pretending to be a fool, declared a damnatio memoriae. All of Caligula's statues were to be destroyed, all of his coins melted down, and his name chiselled off public inscriptions. But some things cannot be erased by decree. The children from the breeding programme grew up in the palace, orphans of a monstrous system, never knowing who their true parents were. The victims grew old, carrying their secrets in silence. The fathers who had held the torches could never again look their daughters in the eye without seeing the flickering flame of their cowardice. It was not a man who had died in that corridor, it was a system, and systems have a way of surviving their creators. The thunder that had rumbled on the night of his ascension returned on that final night, a final fitting echo. In his villa on the Esquiline Hill, Marcus Claudius, the old senator, heard the news of the emperor's death, and he applauded. He clapped his hands together with the very same hands Vimila had once been forced to hold a torch, illuminating the violation of his legacy. His daughter Claudia, known in the secret archives only as number 247, would never speak again. Caligula did not invent depravity. He did not invent cruelty. But he did invent the manual for its institutionalization. He perfected the bureaucracy of abuse. And that manual, though its physical pages were burned by order of the new emperor, always finds a way of being rewritten. The children of his system, the nameless, parentless offspring of his selective breeding program, learned a harsh lesson. They learned that there are evils that transcend their perpetrators, evils that become embedded in the very institutions of power and that are transmitted like a generational disease. If this story has unsettled you, if it has made you look away, then share it. Not for the sake of morbid curiosity, but for the sake of memory. Because to forget how systems of abuse are constructed is to grant permission for them to be rebuilt. Subscribe for more stories where the past serves as a stark warning for the present, where the monsters are not mythical creatures, but men given too much power, and the societies that allow them to wield it.